When Gurpreet said I was the keynote speaker, that meant I was supposed to talk a little longer than some of the other people. And if it becomes too much, you just wave your hands and go, enough, enough. One of the things, Gurpreet's been contributing articles to the Georgia Straight since before I was editor in 2005, but he's become just a terrific friend of mine. And there's so much I can say about Gurpreet. He's funny. If anyone's ever seen the website where Gurpreet is putting a turban on my head before the Vaisakhi parade, you can see Gurpreet's sense of humor. He's also extremely compassionate. He has integrity. He has a sharp mind. And I've benefited enormously from what I've learned from Gurpreet over the years. And he's probably the most courageous journalist I've ever known. And through his wisdom, his intellect, his work ethic, his bravery, his love for humanity, I believe he's helping make Canada a better country. And his new book, Fighting Hatred with Love, is just the latest example of how he's promoting more understanding in our country. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture, because I think that can provide context into kind of where Gurpreet fits into this. One of the biggest challenges I feel with Canada is moving beyond its past. Many of you know that in the 19th century, Canada was moving toward becoming a diverse, multicultural society. We had a large First Nations population. We had growing numbers of people moving here from China, from Japan, from the Indian subcontinent, as well as from Europe. And some of the people were fleeing the impact of colonialism. So the British were more or less looting India, and they were flooding China with opium. So it's not surprising that some of the people living there might want to get out and come go build a new life in North America. But sometimes that involved trading one form of colonialism for another form, doing backbreaking labor on the farms, in the mines, working on the railroads. I can remember Bill Chu of Canadians for Reconciliation telling me that in 1881, the non-native population of BC, 20% were actually of Chinese descent. We had American slaves moving to British Columbia, former American slaves. We had a governor, our first governor, Sir James Douglas, was partially of African descent, actually, and his roots went back to the Caribbean. And his wife was of Aboriginal descent. And under his leadership, 14 treaties were negotiated on Vancouver Island. So these were known as the Douglas Treaties. So many Punjabis were also attracted to BC, helped build the forest industry, develop agriculture. They weren't allowed in the professions, but eventually one of them became premier. Happens to be sitting here right now. But most people in Canada don't think much about Punjab if they're not of Indian or Pakistani descent. And I think it's important to recognize that Punjab has often been in the crosshairs of great collisions between cultures because of its geographic location. And I will get to how this deals with Gurpreet. You had Alexander the Great and his armies. You had the Persians. You had the Mughals. British tried to subjugate Punjab. There was a horror of partition. 1 million people died, maybe 800,000 in Punjab. You had what happened in Delhi in 1984, not to mention the situation in Gujarat in 2002. So given this history, it's no wonder that many people from Punjab would want to come to Canada and create this better life. But something happened on the way to Canada becoming this multicultural paradise in the 19th century. And there was a huge backlash from the industrial class and, I'm sorry to say, from the labor movement. And Douglas, this relatively enlightened governor, was replaced by some hardliners who didn't want to negotiate Aboriginal treaties. So one of the key people at that time was Joseph Trutch, BC's first lieutenant governor, and he was close to the colonial governor, a man named Anthony Musgrave. So Sir John A. Macdonald wanted to bring British Columbia into Canada and connect the country with the railway, but the BC leaders at that time didn't want anything to do with Native Indians. So under the terms of union, what happened was the Aboriginal people became the sole responsibility of the federal government. There would be no treaties for 130-odd years till Glenn Clark was actually the premier. And the Aboriginal people were rounded up and put on reserves. Any claims to their land were rejected. They couldn't vote. Laws were passed denying them the right to legal representation. Basically, everything was stolen from them, including their culture, including their language. They were sent to schools and taught to be white people. But it wasn't just the Aboriginal people who endured this discrimination. Various laws were brought in to stop people from Asia moving here, and many of you in this room are obviously familiar with that. There was the continuous journey legislation that prevented people from South Asia from coming to British Columbia because you couldn't have a stop along the way, and it was impossible not to come without stopping in Hong Kong for provisions. And that's when a man named Gurpreet Singh Sandhu charted the Komagata Maru to challenge this racist legislation. And I personally find it somewhat disgusting that in the city of Vancouver, where I live, there's a street named for Joseph Trutch, who played such a major role in discrimination in British Columbia, but there's no street named for Gurpreet Singh, who played a major role in fighting discrimination. And for a long time, the Komagata Maru event was commemorated with a tiny plaque at the foot of Thurlow Street, and nobody in Vancouver knew about it. And thanks to the work of Raj Hundal, who's in the room, that is changing. And I think Raj deserves some congratulations. And I just want to read a quote from Gurpreet Singh from that era. And I think it reflects how Gurpreet interacts with the community. The visions of men are widened by travel and contacts with citizens of a free country. And contacts with citizens of a free country will infuse a spirit of independence and foster yearnings for freedom in the minds of the emasculated subjects of alien rule. So here's a man who helped in the struggle for liberation who's not recognized, but you open up your wallet and you pull out a $50 bill, and we've got a picture of a guy who rounded up Japanese Canadians, seized their possessions, threw them in concentration camps, was the labor minister when the country made a deal with Japan to stop immigration from Japan to Canada. They probably would have done the same with China, except China had such a weak government because of the opium wars and all that had transpired. So they couldn't stop the Chinese from coming, so they started charging them head taxes, $50, $100, $500. And then finally they decided, okay, we're going to ban the immigration from China. So the reason I've gone over all of this, kind of quick snapshot of BC history and Canadian history, is UBC historian Henry Yu has pointed out that what we really experienced in BC was a prolonged period of white supremacy. And it wasn't white supremacy like in Hitler's Germany, where people were thrown in gas chambers. It wasn't white supremacy like in the southern United States, where people of African descent were lynched. But it was white supremacy. People were denied their opportunity in the professions. People were denied the right to vote. And people, in many cases, were denied the right to move here. And I think there's a reason why some people of color who were born in Canada, I'm talking about Canadian-born, sometimes feel less connected to the country, and polls have shown that they even have a lower voter turnout than the population as a whole. And I think it's because they're not reflected in our history. And they're not reflected in the names of our streets. They're not reflected in the names of our parks. They're not reflected in the names of our schools. And I just saw recently in the news, I was reading about Vancouver, and they've got 2 new streets, and they're trying to name them, and they're saying, well, should this be named Nunavut Street or Saskatchewan Street? We don't have a Saskatchewan Street. And I'm going, well, we don't have a Gurpreet Singh Street. We don't have a Milton Wong Street. Like, we've got to fix this. It's a Swiss psychologist, Carl Jung, talks about the concept of the shadow, which is the part of ourselves that we won't acknowledge. And we bury this in our unconscious mind, deny that it exists. I think Canada's shadow, in a Jungian sense, is its collective refusal to truly and honestly acknowledge that white supremacy over several generations took this country on a very damaging detour. And some people even believe that Canada used to be a white country with a few Aboriginal people. And then Pierre Trudeau changed the dynamics and promoted multiculturalism and took the racism out of the Immigration Act. That is not the case at all. We were a very diverse country, and then we were hijacked, and now we're moving back to where the pendulum to where we should be. And there was an immigration minister in the 19th century, Clifford Sifton, who ensured that Asians, blacks, Jews, and Italians were prohibited from receiving land grants to settle the prairies. And had we not gone on this white supremacist detour, Saskatchewan and Winnipeg would probably look a lot more like Vancouver today. And this is where I think Gurpreet's book is important. We lost a lot of human potential by separating families and just denying so many people their chances of achieving their dreams. And fortunately, it's actually an immigrant from India, Gurpreet Singh, has taken actions in very concrete ways to address this injustice. He created a calendar highlighting contributions of many of the South Asian pioneers. And when he brings the calendar, I've even got one in my bag here, when he brings it to our office, I always make a point to bring it to our employees of South Asian descent, and they always get a kick out of it. But it shows that elevates the importance of this history, this hidden history. I know this year's calendar features, a bust of Rabindranath Tagore and how he returned his British knighthood and protested against the Komagata Maru. I never knew until I saw that calendar that Gurpreet and his friends created that Tagore actually had any interest whatsoever in Vancouver. And I've been struck by how several of the South Asian pioneers in Canada also played a role in the Indian independence movement. And until Gurpreet pointed this out to me, I never knew the importance of the Indian newspaper in Vancouver in advancing the anti-colonialist cause in India. So just as what was happening in India affected migration to Canada, I've also discovered, thanks to Gurpreet, that what was happening in BC has also had an influence on India. And we saw, Darshan Canadian. I didn't know who Darshan Canadian was until Gurpreet said, "Charlie, I got an article about this guy named Canadian." I said, "Okay." And I'm always surprised when Gurpreet sends articles because he undersells them. He says, "Well, I got something about this." And then I look at it and I go, "Holy mackerel, I never knew that." Now, in the calendar, by making this calendar, I think Gurpreet is helping bind our country together, and he's addressing what I like to call the shadow, the great Canadian shadow of denial about our history. And that great Canadian shadow of denial was also on display in the bombing of Air India Flight 182. I have a friend who's not here now who knew 18 people on that plane, including his girlfriend. He just graduated from high school in Southern Ontario. It was a monumentally life-changing event for him and actually led him to pursue a career in the media. I also remember reading a book by Bharti Mukherjee and Clark Blaze. Some of you may have read it. Fantastic book called The Sorrow and the Terror. And it made the point that the bombs were placed right at the end of the school year. This ensured that a maximum number of Canadian kids were on board who would be traveling back to India to visit their families at the end of the school year. But it wasn't seen as a Canadian tragedy by many of our leaders at that time. Try to imagine how much that must have stung for the families here in Canada. To have a high-ranking Canadian government official call Rajiv Gandhi to express sorrow when the majority of the passengers were Canadian. Mukherjee said she was so disgusted by Canadian government policies at that time that this actually led her to move to the United States. I won't even get into the stories of the CSIS bungling and the RCMP turf wars and all the things that hampered the investigation. But when Mukherjee left Canada, Canada lost a great writer. She's a phenomenal writer that we lost. But more importantly, through this tragedy, Canada lost dozens and dozens and dozens of kids who might have grown up to become doctors, writers, teachers, playwrights, scientists, judges, politicians, engineers, and who knows what else. I can't put into words the magnitude of what Canada lost. when the bomb went off aboard that plane. And thankfully, Justice John Major helped go some ways towards addressing this with a report that offered some solace to many of the families, albeit far, far too late. For all the positive aspects of Major's inquiry, though, I still don't think he adequately dealt with one of the issues at the root of the tragedy, and that is the great Canadian shadow of collective denial about our white supremacist history, which contributed to seeing local people of Indian descent in the early and mid-1980s as the other, almost like a different group of people altogether. And this prevailing attitude, this great Canadian shadow, gives sustenance to religious fundamentalism and promotes separatism and ultimately leads to catastrophes like the Air India bombing. And Gurpreet has tried to bring about reconciliation. His new book brings us the voices of the families, the Canadians who were left alone in this horrific act. We read of Bal Gupta, who lost his wife. There's Major Singh Sidhu, who lost his sister, his niece, his nephew. There's Lata Pada, the Toronto dancer, who lost her husband and 2 teenage daughters. I see Dave Hare's in the audience. He lost his father as a result of this, and I'm sorry for that. And in the face of this, Gurpreet Singh has demonstrated his courage in bravely pointing out shortcomings of what he sees in the local Indian media's coverage of this tragedy. And for that, he gets vilified on a regular basis. But he soldiers on because he's here to help create a better Canada. The Nobel Prize-winning intellectual Amartya Sen, some of you may have heard of him. He is a Bengali by birth. He wrote a fantastic book a few years ago called Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny. And it was a response to Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, which suggested there's an inevitable conflict between the East and the West. Well, Sen noted that we're actually not as different from one another as we sometimes think. Democracy flourished in Japan long, long time ago. Complex mathematical computations were occurring in the Arab world long before the European Enlightenment. And he pointed out, and I think this is really key, that we have a multiplicity of identities. We may define ourselves by our religion or by our ethnic background, but we're just as likely to define ourselves by our occupation, our class, our family status, our sexual orientation, or even our hobbies or our educational level. On the face of it, Gurpreet and I may seem quite different, but we're both journalists. We're curious about the world. We both wonder how actions in one part of the world boomerang in other parts. We both worry about religious fundamentalism, the minimum wage. We both like to write. I would suggest that I have more in common with Gurpreet than most of the Canadian-born Caucasian people that I work with at the Georgia Strait. Or all of them. I don't know. So Amartya Sen was pointing out the real danger comes from reducing people to just one aspect of their identity, especially if that aspect is religion. And so after 9/11, Tony Blair and George Bush and other world leaders made a point of meeting with the religious leaders. And our Canadian multicultural policies have a tendency to inflate the importance of religious leaders as well, sometimes through financial contributions, sometimes by showering attention on them, through visits to temples or mosques or gurdwaras or synagogues or churches. And Amartya Sen and Gurpreet have always understood that this carries some risks. You can come up. And the risk is, that's no problem. The risk is especially so when these religious leaders are extremely conservative, patriarchal, homophobic. You can sit wherever you like. So when the politicians kind of hobnob with these conservative, patriarchal, homophobic religious leaders, it actually has a tendency, and this is something that was pointed out recently in a lecture by Keenan Malik as well, that it has the tendency of marginalizing progressive voices within the communities who may be battling these same very forces of repression. So in BC in the 1980s, the fanatics were given a free hand to plan, as Gurpreet often points out, the worst case of aviation terrorism in world history before 9/11. Gurpreet has helped teach me about the damage that religious communalism can have, not only in BC, but also in India, which has been so deeply scarred by partition and the violence in Delhi, and more recently Gujarat, where Narendra Modi's thugs went on a killing spree against the Muslim community. I remember reading not too long ago in a candid moment, Rahul Gandhi told the US government that he's actually more concerned about Hindu fundamentalism than Muslim fundamentalism in India. And that was thanks to WikiLeaks. And I might say about Gurpreet, he doesn't discriminate when it comes to highlighting the dangers of fundamentalism. And his desire to give a voice to the victims of the Air India bombings, and let's not forget about the Narita explosion, is one of the many ways he's advancing the cause of secularism in Canada. And I enjoy giving Gurpreet a voice in our publication, because I don't want our paper to fall into the same trap as George Bush, Tony Blair, and, dare I say, Jason Kenney. I'm going to close by just saying, by giving a voice to the Air India victims, by giving a voice to progressives in the community, by elevating awareness of our progressive Indian pioneers in BC, Gurpreet Singh is helping to build the type of Canada that I can be proud of. And on behalf of all Canadians who share my views, I want to thank you, Gurpreet, for what you're giving to the country. In your own way, you're improving our Canadian level of consciousness, and he's probably never thought of himself as a therapist before, but that's sometimes how I look upon the work he's doing. And you're helping us heal from the wounds of the great Canadian shadow, and it's a noble enterprise, and it's one that's having long-lasting effects, positive effects. And thank you very much. And I hit the clock.
साहिबान, आज बैसाखी का दिन है। Position, load.